Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Pichincha Galo wash processed Ecuador from S&W Craft Roasting. And there's the bag right there. And S&W, based out of Coatesville, Indiana. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions, including earlier this year when we did a mini-series on their coffee, including a blind taste test video. And at the conclusion of that series, I determined that they're a coffee roaster that I did want to revisit in the future. So when I saw them releasing a Mejorado coffee, it definitely caught my interest, coupled with the fact that this one is one of Galo Morales' Mejorado coffees. And the only other one we've had this year was the one we had from Coatesville. So it definitely felt like a great opportunity to revisit S&W and also compare and contrast it with that Mejorado. So it'll be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 45. And the recipe we went with for this coffee was surprisingly a higher extraction one at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So once again, S&W does have a chart on their website which does list how lightly profiled their coffees are, and from the ones that we had reviewed earlier this year, it's actually in the middle ground of that, as it's not necessarily the lightest one that we've had from them, but even then it's definitely not the most developed either. And it is kind of interesting because that Galo Morales that we did review from Coatesville earlier this year did feel a slight bit more developed than we typically experience from that coffee roaster. But as far as the roast profile of this one goes, once again, I would say it's on the slightly lighter side of that light medium, as once again it's not necessarily an overly light coffee, but even then I would still say skewing slightly lighter by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 21, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and it was a very interesting first impression, as the biggest takeaway I had was that this coffee was brighter than the majority of other versions of this coffees and Mejorados we've reviewed up to this point, as usually I have a pretty mixed result when it comes to the overall brightness and intensity in that regard, so didn't necessarily know what to make of that. But outside of that, it was a bit more citric forward than expected, with a slight bitterness to the citrus and a bit of floral herbality as well, lending itself towards a unique first impression, as it wasn't really overly reminiscent of the one that we had reviewed from Coatesville based off of this first impression. Day 24 through the Chemex, and this iteration of the coffee was a lot more in line with the expectations that we did have, as it was a bit more pronounced in terms of the sweetness, as well as a floral herbality continuing to remain present within this one. It was still skewing a slight bit more on the citric side of things, but the brightness felt better balanced, so I mostly attributed that first experience to maybe something being a little bit off with the way that we brewed it. So we move on to day 27 as we opted for the April brewer, and the coffee is continuing to trend more in line with expectations, as it's now offering a sugary and toffee-like experience, especially within the cool down, much more reminiscent of what I usually expect from Mejorado coffees. At that sense, there's still a slightly mixed result, as immediately off brew it is slightly uneven once again in that citric quality, contrasting the herbality to it as well. So it's improving nonetheless, but I was continuing to still struggle with this coffee from these first couple of impressions, which did take me back a little bit. But I said, this is usually the case with Mejorado coffees. Usually what seems to work is toning these coffees down, and that's the first direction I went as we opted for the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, and it did continue to offer plenty of these similar experiences to the Coatesville version, with perhaps a bit more intensity to the brightness, but also an abundance of the toffee-like quality. So I would say that it seemed to help. However, on the back end, the citric quality does continue to feel uneven at points, but it's pretty sweet otherwise. That just seemed to kind of throw off the majority of this coffee. Day 33 through the Chemex with some slightly higher extraction adjustments. And what happened here was I had seen some feedback from some other people saying that this coffee really seemed to shine when pushing it a bit more, and that's counter to the majority of experiences I had with Mejorado coffees. But I said, well, we'll see what happens. Let's go that complete opposite direction. And weirdly enough, it improved dramatically as the struggles of the unevenness felt interestingly corrected, as it was a bit more direct and better defined, with the citric intensity notably toned down and a better defined sweetness to the coffee. A slight stone fruit giving it some depth as well. So I'm like, okay, we're starting to work with something here. I'm starting to experience what I was really hoping to experience from this one. So on day 36, we opted for the V60 with the same adjustments, and the coffee was back to being a slight bit inconsistent, as it was much more similar to the other days of this coffee, with that citric quality still being a bit less even. So I wasn't entirely sure what to make of that, because I said, okay, well, maybe it was just the temperature that we had brewed this coffee with. Maybe we were kind of under extracting this coffee, but that wasn't necessarily the case when we opted for the V60. So it continued to struggle. Outside of that, it did improve as it cooled down, with plenty of these sweeter characteristics to it in that toffee-like sense and some slight vanilla qualities. So we decided to go back to the Chemex on day 39 with our standard recipe. And this was more inconsistency, because even though it was still nice, it still wasn't quite as good as when we had pushed this coffee, as it continues to feel slightly uneven, with the majority of it being an undefined citric sense. Mostly still orange, but at this time I would say some slight pineapple and vanilla to complement this apple-like brightness to it. So on day 42, interestingly enough, we went back to the Chemex with the higher extraction adjustments, and it seemed to work again. Here on day 45, we have that same recipe, and it seems to work again, as it's back to its best, offering a vanilla toffee candy bar-like sweetness, high red florals, most notably I would say, in a little bit more of a hibiscus-like feel, which can give it a little bit of a Kenyan-like characteristic, some orange zest to it, an apple bit of brightness as well, and some slight apricot-like components, giving it, I would say, just a fair bit of depth in terms of the fruit profile. So this time around, a much better experience. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. So let's go ahead and start with the cleanliness level 4. So even though there may have been some things that might have taken away from the overall definition and clarity of this coffee, at the end of the day, it is still a wash processed Ecuadorian coffee, and it still did offer enough clarity and definition to a lot of the aspects within it. Most notably, I would say the sweetness. So I was happy with it scoring there at that level 4, though certainly expected within this one. Finish, level 4, and I would say that that was most predominantly focused within that, I would say, classic Mejorado candied-like sweetness that is present within the finish a lot of the time. So for that reason, it is scoring there at that level 4, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it's an overly lingering sense to it. It does finish pretty even, despite the fact that at times the coffee wasn't necessarily the most even. Sweetness, level 4, and that in itself is always going to be a little tricky when it comes to Mejorado coffees, because I go into them hoping that they will score that level 5, as oftentimes I've had these coffees score level 5, and even at times something I would describe as a level 6. This one's very sweet. I think I would have to go back and kind of reassess the coffees that we've had from S&W in the past. Maybe as far as the non-processed coffees go, this one's probably the sweetest that we've experienced, so it definitely still had plenty of that. We move on, florality, level 4. And I think maybe going into this one, I would have expected a slightly different floral component to it. But once again, it offered a slightly Kenyan-like florality to it, which a lot of people have said Mejorado coffees can offer Kenyan-like characteristics. And I have experienced some of that in the past with other Mejorados. So level 4, kind of interesting. I also did lump the slight vanilla-like florality to it as well within that note. We move on, citrus fruit, level 4. And as mentioned, I think most predominantly for me, it was a bit more reminiscent of an orange zest. And I feel like that's why a lot of the times it felt a little bit more uneven within this coffee, as opposed to maybe a true orange-like characteristic to it. Outside of that, there's a slight pineapple that can be present, I would say, in a little bit more subtle of a sense that's in this coffee. So it's just a little interesting, given that I can have a fair bit of citrus in Mejorado coffees, but this one just maybe had a little bit more than I might have expected going into it. Then we have a handful of level 3s. We will start with the acidity level 3. And I feel like that's a very interesting talking point, because right from the onset I said, wow, this is actually a lot brighter than it probably should be. But towards the end, I would say that it evened out a little bit more. And at times I would say that it still felt uneven, given that there was that kind of interesting citric quality to it. So level 3 just felt the best place to put that. We move on, stone fruit, level 3. I think I most closely align this and attribute this one to being a bit more of an apricot-like component, as that was also something that I experienced in traces within the Coffea Circular version of this coffee. Caramel level 3, that's exclusively the toffee-like aspect. And honestly, high side level 3, I feel like we've gotten to a point when scoring these Mejorado coffees that it's either going to score a minimum of a level 3, because it does have that sweet candy component to it, that brown candy component, in at least a notable manner, as opposed to some of the other ones that are just abundantly prominent as possible. So those score level 4, level 5. Though this one definitely is still pretty well defined, pretty pronounced within this coffee. And then the final thing worth discussing, the body level 3. And oftentimes I can have mixed results with that, but I feel like what was really surprising is, since I do usually have mixed results with it scoring level 2, level 3 with the V60, it's always interesting that the Chemex seemed to score this one at a level 3, which does go to show that it just typically had a bit more body, a bit more robustness to it in that sense. So that was kind of interesting to me. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like I have to be pretty honest with it, and the biggest thing I've had is that, I don't want to say so many, but quite a few people that have discussed this coffee recently have said that it's been one of their favorite coffees of the year, that it was a true standout, it was exceptional, and I feel like I read a lot of those things before I ended up purchasing this coffee. And given that I'd had really positive experiences with S&W, Galo Morales, and obviously Mejorado coffees are my favorite varietal other than maybe Geishas in general, this one had sky-high expectations going into it, and I fully expected S&W to continue to live up to the very positive experiences I've had from them in the past, and I feel like that's why, given that this coffee at times was pretty inconsistent for me, it didn't necessarily live up to a lot of the expectations that I did have for it. Don't get me wrong, it was very nice. As I always say, when it comes to Mejorado coffees, it'd be very surprising if I didn't at the very least enjoy them thoroughly. This one, on the other hand, while I did enjoy it, it just had such high expectations going into it that if it wasn't going to be one of my favorite coffees from S&W, which it wasn't, it's not necessarily going to live up to those expectations. And I feel like the main reason why it wasn't one of my favorite coffees that I've had from S&W is because I was really impressed by the majority of the other ones that we have had from them, most notably the coffees that do have a bit more processing that turned out cleaner. So having those coffees turn out cleaner and much more even versus this one right here, which didn't seem to hold true and was a little inconsistent at times, was a little bit of a shift from what I was expecting from this coffee. But that does kind of take me into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It definitely has plenty of the classic Mejorado characteristics to it, and I feel like if you do get it at a good point, like we did with a very weird recipe and a very weird brew method, then this coffee does have really nice potential. As I would say, those days where we were able to get this coffee at its best, it was on par with the majority of really promising Mejorados that we have reviewed this year. That being said, it took a lot more tinkering and a lot more work to get it to that point. So all of that's to say, this coffee can be a little tricky, but with a little bit of effort, it can turn out into something that is very delightful. I feel like that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Pichincha Galo Morales Wash Processed Ecuador from S&W Craft Roasting. Thank you for watching.